Welcome to Genre Chat. I'm Sherry Lynn Bisbano. This week, we're talking about co-writing, and we have someone who's co-written with Josh McDowell, with Sean McDowell, with Timothy Smith, and this one might give him away, J.M. Hostetler. We have none other than Bob Hostetler with us. Bob, welcome. Tell us a little bit about yourself for those, yay,
Well,
who don't know about you.
I have to let the applause die down before I start talking. That's what I've learned from my stand-up comedy routine. Anyway, I've been, people ask me all the time, how did you get started writing? And my standard answer is I've just kind of always been a writer. I was raised in a family of readers and writers. And so that's just kind of a part of the warp and woof of who I am, mostly the woof. But yeah, it's been a privilege to not only write, on my own, but to co-author with some incredible people over the years who have been and remain to be friends, and one of whom is even a relative, as you mentioned.
Yes.
At the outset. So, except that her name is pronounced Hostetler.
Really?
Yeah, because, well, among the Amish and Mennonite, which is our family background,
Yes.
it's more commonly pronounced, whether it's spelled as her name is spelled with a CH before the S, or without the CH, like my name is spelled, it's usually pronounced Hostetler. So when I go amongst my Amish and Mennonite relatives, I'll just stick with the Hostetler.
Oh, well, thank you for that clarification because I pronounced it wrong. I'd like to talk about that book later because I'm reading the first one. But
Oh, yeah.
I want to ask you, how did you get into co-writing? Especially, was your first co-author Josh McDowell?
Yeah. But first dozen books or so were with Josh. We were actually put together by an editor way back in the day before you were even born.
I doubt it.
I sent out, the very first time I sent out book proposals, I actually sent out two, one of which has never seen the light of day. But the other one that I had mailed out to several of the publishers, that I dreamed of working with, I actually got a phone call in my office at midday, couple weeks after mailing this book proposal out, and it was Joey Paul, who was then at Word Books in Waco, and he's now at Nelson. Just a wonderful gentleman. But Joey, to make a very long story short, Joey said he liked my proposal and complimented several things about it, and then kind of tripped over things and hemmed and hawed for a few moments, and finally said, I'll just come out and ask. We're under contract with Josh McDowell for something similar to this proposal. And so rather than just rejecting it out of hand, I thought I'd sound you out and see if you might consider co-authoring this with you.
Twist my arm.
Well, and I kind of said that. I said, I'd be a fool to say no. I can't imagine that honor. And he said, well, some writers prefer to do their own thing, and they don't want to, share the spotlight or the vision or whatever it may be. And I said, well, yeah, that's not me. It'd be an honor. And so he said, well, okay, I'll check with Josh and get back to you. And so within a month or so, Josh and I were sending material back and forth. This was before email, really. So we were FedExing chapters and portions of chapters back and forth soon after that conversation. So it really started with Joey, an editor who put us together for the book that became Don't Check Your Brains at the Door.
I got that book for my son. He loves it.
Well, thank you.
Great book. You actually signed it for me at the conference. But how many books have you written with Josh McDowell? I stopped counting, I think, at 6.
I think I'd have to check myself, but I think it's about 10 or 11. So we wrote together through the 90s, and then in the year 2000. My wife and I planted a church just up the road, 10 miles up the road from where we live. And so I said to Josh, I really need to focus on the church. Actually, this was a couple years into it, but I said, I really need to focus more on the church these days. And so my writing for about a decade took a back seat. I still continued to do things, but wasn't able to keep up the schedule that Josh needed. He's an amazing man. He's in his 70s, I think now, and makes me tired. So, so we remain friends and we stay in touch as much as possible. But that was basically for a season of my life when I co-authored those 10, 11 books with Josh.
Now, you did different types of books with him. You've done devotionals and other types. Can you explain when you co-write? I mean, you have the one person, so you guys probably understand how each other thinks. But when you go into different genres, how does that affect the relationship, the writing,
Well, everyone has been a little bit different. And not only the Josh books, but every co-authored project, at least that I've participated in, has been different. There's some commonalities. One of the things that I always suggest to writers is get it on paper. Who's doing what. Write it down. Make sure how are the advances and royalties going to be split. That sort of thing. Get that in writing, and then you can just put that aside and proceed. But with Josh and I, don't check your brains at the door. I first drafted a bunch of chapters. He first drafted a bunch of chapters, and then we traded them and revised each other's work back and forth. For Right from Wrong, which I think came out in '94, I flew out. At that time, Josh was living in California, so I flew out to California once a month for about 6 months, and we sat across the table from each other for a week, solid, 8, 9 hours a day, and I would just pick his brain, and I had my little Power Book 100, and I'd take notes. Then I'd go back and I'd do the writing for 3 weeks, and then we'd get back together. And then one more example is we did a reference book. Don't Check Your Brains at the Door was for teens. In between, we did a couple teen novels together, and then Right from Wrong was for adults, for parents and pastors. And then we came out with this kind of reference book called Josh McDowell's Handbook on Counseling Youth. And that was a different process because basically Josh's contribution was he shipped me about 7,000 pages of research.
Oh, wow.
And said, see what you can do with this. And so I started going through it, and he had the vision of he wanted to do something that would help pastors, youth pastors, teachers, etc., to help counsel kids who come to them. Hey, I'm pregnant. Hey, my parents are divorcing. Whatever it might be, and so I started to outline the book and put this together from the research, and we cooperated in that, but his main contribution to that was the research, and I did much of the writing. So everyone's been a little bit different. It really, at least in my experience, it's the project itself that guides who does what and how two authors cooperate.
If somebody wants to get, like, say me, if I wanted to get a co-writer for one of my books, how would I go about doing that?
Well, it should be somebody that you already know and like, because there's way too many horror stories of partnerships that just didn't work out, and it's hard enough. I find it difficult to collaborate myself, just because, and I've been told that I have a gift for getting in, like, for example, with Josh, for getting into his skin and writing, with his voice more than my voice, that sort of thing. But really, it's not my preferred mode. I'd rather just sit down and start typing myself. But you have to cooperate with each other when you collaborate. So I'd suggest it's got to be somebody that you already know, something of their skills, that your personalities mesh together, and then you might bring up the topic of, would you consider It can start with an email. It can start with a conversation in the hallway, any number of ways. But I really, it's interesting. I say that, and yet, other than my co-authored historical novels with Joan Hostetler,
Mm.
someone else has put me together with collaborators rather
Ah.
than me. It's always been an editor or an agent who made that partnership start. So I guess I haven't always followed my own advice, but I have had one or two projects that started, and very, very quickly it became clear that the other author and I were not a match. And so we just parted friends, and it's better to nip it in the bud.
Yes, that's great advice. Now, you were mentioning earlier about some of the things that you need to establish, like a contract or fees or things like that. Can you elaborate on that?
Well, it's basically just two areas, well, three areas, I guess, that I would suggest people pay attention to and get in writing. One is, first and foremost, what kind of a partnership is this? Who does what? Because there are shades in collaborations. For example, my books with Josh, well, actually all of my co-authored books have been Bob Hostetler, Josh McDowell and Bob Hostetler. One thing you might establish is, does it matter who gets top billing? Does that matter? I've always insisted that Josh do, because he's the star, and he's the visionary behind the project. And in fact, Joan and I had a similar conversation where, we're both writers and editors and so on and so forth. And so we tried to give each other, she gave me top billing on the cover and that sort of thing. But that's one thing you want to get established first off is, okay, who does what? What kind of and the shades would be Josh McDowell and Bob Hostetler says something different than Josh McDowell with Bob Hostetler.
Can you elaborate on that a little bit? Because I know that those little words mean so much.
Right. The with, usually, at least to industry insiders, with so-and-so generally indicates that person whose name follows the with was the writer on the project.
Sort of like a ghost writer?
No, it's not a ghost, because you get credit as with so-and-so. But it does mean, like, for example, if it were say a baseball star or a football star or somebody like that, it's a celebrity, Tim Tebow with Bob Hostetler. That indicates that, well, Tim really he's not the writer, but that the with guy, the co-author, had to pull out his information, and that was the writer, right?
Okay.
When it says Josh McDowell and Bob Hostetler, that's an indication that both of these people contributed content, and that the lines weren't so clearly divided between who's telling the story and who's writing it down, who's the writer on the project. So with usually means that's the writer. And then there's a third shade that's as told to, which basically means that, the as told to writer shaped the content, but didn't necessarily guide it.
Okay.
All right. So those are the shades that happen so you want to establish that, who does what. In some cases, it's like Josh and my first project, where you first draft every other chapter and send it back and forth from each other. But in others, like in collaborating in a novel, for example, say you have two protagonists, maybe a male and a female. The male writes the male POV character, and the female writes the female POV. So, but you need to establish that. Then you need to establish the money. Is it a 50-50 split, or is it? And sometimes when both authors have an agent, then you need to involve both agents, because the agents have to split their percentage as well. And then the third thing I would say is you just want to establish what happens if we disagree.
Right.
Right. So who does one or the other of us have? That wasn't me, by the way. I don't know what that was.
I'm sorry. I was was trying to be discreet, but I was moving my computer because the sun's shining in and it's making me look like I'm on Touch by an Angel.
I just want to establish that wasn't me. So that didn't come
So
from
funny.
this room. Anyway.
You sure you shouldn't have gotten top billing?
But the, in some cases, one person has the deciding vote, even if it's a 50-50 partnership. But in other cases, you need to say, for example, if we disagree, then so-and-so's agent will have or so-and-so's editor will have the deciding vote. But you need to establish those things up front before you get very deep. So
I want to ask you, what is the biggest lesson you've learned co-writing books? It could be a personal, it could be a lesson on writing, or both?
Well, it's mainly a lesson on writing, and that is that one of the good things that a co-authoring, a collaboration has done for me at least, is it has underscored and shined a spotlight on my writing weaknesses. Because we all have them.
Yes.
We don't see them ourselves, right? But when you collaborate with somebody, like for example, in writing with Joan, she's a wonderful novelist and historical novelist par excellence. And she pointed out to me repeatedly in one of our drafts that it wasn't just me. She had some weaknesses too, but I'll stick with mine. But that I constantly had detached hands appearing. He held up a hand as if it wasn't his hand, it wasn't attached. So I realized, wow. And she also pointed out to me that I use nod way too much. Everybody's nodding.
Bobbleheads.
So those are just two examples, but if you can stand it, if you can take it, it's like a protracted critiquing relationship, because your co-author should and would point out to you, you do this a lot. Let's stop doing that and so it improved me as a writer, not only with Joan, but with Timothy and with Josh and Sean as well.
That's great. Now tell us a little bit about, now Sean, is that Josh's relative?
His son, yeah.
His son. Now what did you write with him, and how was that collaboration different than Josh's?
That was just one book, and Sean had done he had contracted with a publisher to do kind of a set, a resource set called the God Quest. And wanted various different products, one of which was to be a novel, an adult contemporary novel, but that taught some of the things that the other products taught. So I didn't hear that through Josh, more is the pity, but my agent, Steve Lobby, heard from the publisher. The publisher had contacted him and probably several other agents to say, we need a writer. Do you know any novelists that might collaborate with Sean? And he answered, well, I happen to know somebody who worked with Josh, and so how about that? So Steve put us together, and it was a happy relationship. The novel was called, similarly to the God Quest, it was called The Quest.
The Quest, So, now, what about Timothy Smith?
Yeah, that was another one that came through our agents, because Timothy had contacted Dan Balo, who is another agent with the Steve Lobby agency. And Dan and Steve were talking about this guy who's got a brilliant book. He's just an amazing man, a real life treasure hunter.
Wow.
In many ways. But he needed help. He'd never written a book. He needed help putting this amazing thing together. And so Dan talked to Steve talked to me. And so Timothy and I were put together by our two agents for the book that was released last April, called The Chamberlain Key. It's being re-released now as The God Code. Partly because Easter week, there will be a History Channel television series hosted by Timothy Smith,
Wow.
The God Code, because some of the discoveries that Timothy made in the Hebrew text of the Old Testament relate to the identity of Jesus and the reality of the risen Christ. And it's very, I call it the differentest book I've ever written. But that was
Sounds
one
like a
where
book I want to read.
it's fascinating.
I love that kind of stuff.
It is fascinating. And, a lot of your viewers probably read the Bible Code years ago. This isn't that, because the Bible Code, the author actually didn't believe in the Bible, didn't believe in God. Timothy is not that guy. He believes in God. He believes in the Bible and believes that the things he's found, these anomalies, these messages, these strange coincidences, actually point to the person of Jesus. And it's fascinating to read. And
I can't wait I'm going to go get it.
in fact, Timothy's as of yesterday, is in Jerusalem right now, filming parts of that TV series that relate to the book. So it'll be fun to see how they do the reality show based on the book.
I'm looking forward to that. That sounds really fascinating. So is there anybody you want to co-write with that you haven't?
Well, there's one regret I have. Let me put it that way.
Okay.
Well, yeah, I do. I want to co-write with Max Lucado and Jerry Jenkins, and because they're famous and would make me a lot of money. But
Are you going to Blue Ridge?
oh, I'll be at Blue Ridge, yeah.
So Jerry's going to be there.
Jerry's a friend, so
I know.
he's never picked up the phone and called me, though. I don't understand what's with that. But the one regret I have, 10, 15 years ago maybe, it was, it would have been around 97, 98 or thereabouts. I got a call from Prison Fellowship headquarters.
Mm-hmm.
And they asked me to come and meet, and make a long story short, to meet with Chuck Colson. So I flew to that area of Virginia, wherever, Northern Virginia, and had a wonderful lunch with Chuck Colson, and just hit it off. I thought hit it off tremendously, and they did. They wanted me to collaborate on a project that would have taken about a year to do. Fortunately, because of my other contracts with Josh and other publishers, I didn't have a year to give them.
Mm.
So I had to turn that project down, and I've always regretted that. It would have been such an honor to work with
Chuck Colson is great. He's great. So do you have a work in progress now? And is it on your own, or is it with somebody else?
No, this one is, I have a children's book set to come out probably later in the latter half of the year from Tommy Nelson, from the Thomas Nelson Publishers. It will be my first children's book. And
what's it called?
Well, it's going to be retitled, I'm pretty sure. The working title was, and the title that sold it was Don't Close Your Eyes. And it's meant to be a bedtime book for a parent or caregiver to read to a child, to say, I know you're tired, but don't close your eyes, you'll just go to sleep. I know your eyelids are very heavy, but don't close your eyes.
I love it. Now you're going to make me close my eyes, because you tell a kid not to, they're going to do it.
Exactly. That's the idea. Reverse psychology, and the repetition of mentioning that you're tired, you're closing your eye. Hopefully that'll do the trick.
Well, I'm going to pray that you and Jerry can maybe co-write something together. He doesn't really co-write with people, though, does he?
He has in the past, because he actually, early on in his career, he did a lot of sports profiles.
Well, yeah, that's right. He did. What am I thinking?
Yeah.
I interviewed him for biographies on Genre Chat here. And what am I thinking? Of course he does.
Yeah, and he used to
call Behind series.
He used to call himself the most famous writer you've never heard of, but now he can't say that anymore.
He's a great guy.
Yeah, he is.
He's a great guy. So do you have any parting words of wisdom, Bob, for somebody who wants to get a co-writer or wants to get into co-writing, or
Well, yeah, I think it's the goal isn't I want to co-author. I don't think that would be the goal. You should, if you decide to co-author, it should be because you know someone who brings something to the project that you don't. And
Right,
so
right.
it's a collaboration is not about, well, we're doing this for the sake of co-authoring, or even I would suggest necessarily for combining. You can't really combine two pitiful platforms to make one good one, but what you want to do is the purpose is to bring two people into the mix who each have something wonderful to contribute to the project, and that's why you should co-author.
Right, because that was one reason why I wanted to have you on here, is because it's something I'm thinking about as a new writer. I don't have as much education as other people do, but I've been told my story's a good story, but it needs to be written well. So I've been praying about getting a co-author, somebody who has the education and the talent to maybe help me. Personally, I don't care who gets their name first. But anyway, thank you so much, Bob. If somebody wants to get a hold of you, how would they do that?
Well, my website is bobhostetler.com. It's just my name, BOBHOSTETLER, bobhostetler.com. And there is a contact form on the website that goes right to my email. So that would be the easiest way, as well as through the stevelobby.com website as an agent with Steve Lobby Agency.
Now, you're going to be at some conferences this year, right? Now, how can people, you're so approachable. People can come up and talk to you, and you're actually very, very, very funny. So, I mean, I think you should have your own comedy show at these conferences. But what conferences can people look for you at? Blue Ridge, we already talked about that. Are you going to be at any others?
From your lips to God's ears. I'm available for a sitcom or a
You and Tori Martin, you two should do one.
Yeah, we could collaborate.
You could co-author.
Yes, we could. But anyway, yeah, I'll be at Blue Ridge. I'll be at Florida next month. I'll be at the Asheville conference next month. The Blue Lake, which is a new writers retreat in Alabama, at Montrose and Taylor University over the summer. I'll be at Lucinda McDowell's New England retreat in the fall.
Are you coming up our way? I might see you there. I'll probably see you at Blue Ridge, but yeah.
Yeah, and the Oregon Christian Writers Conference in the fall. Those are the ones that spring right to mind real quick.
That's it? No. You're because of who you are. I mean, I've heard you speak. You're very inspiring. You're very funny, and you know what you're talking about. And if you have a chance, anybody has a chance to hear him speak at these conferences, you must go. Bob, I want to thank you so much for taking your time to speak with us about co-writing. I just want to thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Sherilyn. It's been an honor and joy. It's always fun to chat with you.
You too. And thank you for tuning into Genre Chat.